Hello. Hello.
There we go.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So
Can you make me an administrator or a host or what?
Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay.
I have you up on my, I guess technically my main monitor. And then all my slides are on the second one.
Mhm.
I'll never go back to just a single monitor.
Yeah, I know I'm missing it here because I just have my laptop here. I thought that would be the advantage of doing it at work.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I was thinking, I added a slide about it towards the very end. Just about like my very last slide is kind of like a next step slide.
Yeah, perfect.
So I put the logistics.
So just direct them. I had a conversation. Oh, hey.
We're good.
Yeah, and it's just directing them to the, okay. Is it possible to change that just to the FrogWatch web site? Just the FrogWatch website at the zoo?
Yeah, I can do that right now.
And then that way that's just easier. And they've got a button on that on the website at the zoo.
Yeah.
The zoo's website.
Yeah.
And then this recording will be up there.
But yeah, I was thinking March 23rd, I'll go to Millennium. And then April 6th, which is 2 weeks after that, I can either do it at Millennium again or choose a different site if we think there's somewhere else that's worth doing it.
Would you say April 3rd?
April 6th, March 23rd and April 6th. It'll be on.
Okay. Yeah. Now we have 2 people waiting.
All right, well, my slides are updated.
Oh, 3 people.
Uh-oh. They're getting antsy, Bill.
Yeah, it's just now 7 o'clock. So you let me know when you want to start letting people in.
I think you can start letting people in. I don't.
Okay.
I'll want to start, I'll give people 5-ish, 10 minutes, whatever, till we actually start.
Sounds good. That should be. Hello, everyone.
Hello. So it's just now 7, so I think we'll probably wait 5-ish minutes to, let as many people roll in as want to before we get started, and then we'll jump into the slides.
Ah.
Okay, well, we'll wait just a few more minutes. But I'm so glad to see you all here. And, if you guys have to leave early, that is just fine. We will have everything recorded. And in addition to that, I'll be doing a couple sort of on-site, training sessions so that we can really practice the procedure. But those will be in a few weeks. As a matter of housekeeping, before we get going, we are recording this training session, obviously, so that we can post the recorded training session. Also, if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat while we're presenting, and one of us, whoever's not talking, will be keeping track of what's going on there so that we can answer your questions either as we go, if that's needed, or just at the end if we feel like they can be left until the end of the presentation. I think now is probably a pretty good time to get going, Bill, if you're all right with that.
That sounds great. Go ahead and get started. I did want one point of order. I probably am realizing that I am showing up electronically there in your Zoom page as Rhiannon Mulligan. That is a misspelling of Bill Flanagan. So I am the conservation manager at the John Ball Zoo.
Yep.
And Travis is our FrogWatch chapter coordinator and one of our herp keepers at the zoo. And without any further ado, take it away, Travis.
Yeah, we are so happy to have you all here, especially as winter starts to wind down. This is a perfect time to start thinking about the frogs in our area and, recording their calls. So we're going to run through a pretty involved overview of what FrogWatch USA is and how to go about those procedures, and then some native frog and toad identification, both visual and call identification. So we'll dive right in because we've got a lot of slides to get through. This is a very brief outline of what we plan to cover and the order that we plan to cover it in. So we're just going to start at the 30,000 foot view of what is FrogWatch USA and citizen science, and then we'll just kind of narrow it down all the way to our IDs. So FrogWatch USA is a long-running citizen science project that has been hosted by the AZA since right around 1998. There's a nationwide network of chapters and volunteers. A lot of them are led by people like me and Bill, who have a passion for local herp conservation and are affiliated with the zoo. And since 1998, there have been over 160,000 observations submitted, which is really, really impressive. And these data have been used to generate several reports and also some presentations at the AZA annual conference, and hopefully have helped influence some management decisions along the way. These data are really beneficial to not only us, but also land managers in the area. They help describe local species diversity. They can really help with the detection of rare and invasive species, because having people like you all in the field cataloging these frog and toad calls, that's just so many more sets of ears and eyes than any one organization like the zoo can afford to hire and send out into the field. We can capture things like shifts in species diversity, range, and phenology, which is just a word for kind of the when in the year certain species appear and are active. knowing about what frogs are where can also help serve as an indicator of wetland health. And as I've alluded to a couple times, it can inform the development of land management strategies in the area. So citizen science as a whole concept and field dates back to the mid 17th century when people were collecting climate and weather data. And since then has really evolved into a large field that assists professional scientists in a variety of ways. A 2016 study indicated that biology, conservation, and ecology are most impacted by citizen science, but we are far from the only fields that that employ the help of people like you. It's common in astronomy and geology as well. And in 2015, one study estimated that the economic value of the hours volunteered by citizen scientists was anywhere from 667 million to $2.5 billion annually. So you can see just how important it is, to have people like you doing this work, because that's just, way outside the scope of what a zoo like John Ball Zoo could afford otherwise. So thank you all so much for the work you do. And why would you want to be a citizen scientist? Well, one, you can learn about and explore just the nature of science and scientific inquiry. You get to engage with your community science organizations, which in this case is us. Hello, thank you. And specifically, you'll be helping us collect scientific data on frogs and toads. With FrogWatch, you'll also learn more about wetlands and local amphibian diversity. And perhaps the best and most rewarding part of all is that you just get to spend some time outside in community wetlands. And we have some really beautiful parks and wetlands here in West Michigan. So there's not much, better way to spend your time just after sunset, in my estimation. A little bit about amphibians. So if you're not familiar with amphibians, they're not fish, but they're also not reptiles. They kind of fall in between those two groups in the evolutionary trees that you often see. The word amphibian means both kinds of life. Amphi, which means of both kinds, and bios, which means life. This refers to both the fact that they live on land and water, and that many amphibians have like a two-phase life cycle, which, if you think of frogs, right, you've got like your tadpole phase, and you've also got your frog phase. The three large groups of amphibians are Anura, which are frogs and toads, Urodela, which are salamanders and newts, and Gymnophiona or Apoda, which are Sicilians. There are roughly 8,000 known species of amphibians, and about 90% of those are frogs. And the very earliest amphibians evolved during the Carboniferous period, and they evolved from lungfish that were able to leave the water and sustain life on land. Unfortunately, amphibians as a group are not doing so well in the current day. 43% of all amphibians are in decline, and 32% are threatened with extinction. And there are so many reasons, that they're declining. But really, the biggest ones are listed here on the screen. We see habitat fragmentation and alteration. So, when you see bulldozers knocking down a forest or a field to put in a subdivision, you're chopping up what is probably good amphibian habitat. Global climate change is really impacting where and how amphibians are able to live. Diseases and pathogens. If you've heard of the chytrid fungus or the ranavirus, those are two hugely impactful diseases that are hurting amphibians around the world. Invasive species can be problematic. Amphibians sometimes get outcompeted by other species that, shouldn't be there, or maybe they're getting eaten by, invasive predators. Chemical contaminants like fertilizers and pesticides often get into water supplies and can cause problems for breeding amphibians. And lastly, commercial exploitation. There are people out there who think it's a great idea to take amphibians from the wild and sell them in the pet trade because that can be pretty lucrative. And that, on top of all these other things, it just makes it too hard for some amphibian populations to overcome. And so that's, those are a lot of the reasons that we're seeing these huge declines. You can see in this little figure on the right-hand side of the screen where we're seeing the most amphibian species in one area. So the darker red it is, the more densely populated with amphibians it is. So those tropical areas right around the equator, you got a lot of little frog species that live in those areas, but also the eastern United States is extremely rich in amphibian diversity. So you can see here that, right above the tip of my mouse is kind of western and southwestern Michigan, and that's in that kind of orange to golden range, which means that we're doing pretty great and have quite a few amphibian species around here, which is something that really excites me personally. So frogs and toads, as we established earlier, are in the order Anura. They are distinguished from other amphibians by being tailless. As a matter of fact, Anura actually means animal without tail. And below are some of the general differentiations between frogs and toads. So a typical frog is going to have smooth or wet and slimy looking skin. They typically lay their eggs in clusters. They live in or immediately adjacent to water. They tend to have skinnier bodies with long, powerful back legs and often move in leaps and jumps. And something that hopefully you guys aren't experiencing, they have teeth in their upper jaw. Toads, on the other hand, have warty or bumpy looking skin. Their eggs are generally laid in long strands. While they rely on water for some things like reproduction, they are capable of traveling pretty impressive distances. So it's not, required that there be a wetland, nearby to find a toad. They tend to have rounder bodies with shorter back legs. And because of that, they kind of walk or hop as opposed to leaping and jumping, and they do not have teeth. So amphibians need wetlands, and that's mostly for breeding, but for several amphibians, it's important for other aspects of their life as well. So we are going to collect our FrogWatch data at wetlands. On this slide and the next one, there are a bunch of different types of wetlands. I'm not going to read everything on these slides, but I'm just kind of going to give an overview of what wetlands are, and they are typically defined by three characteristics. One is the presence of plants that are known to grow in saturated conditions. Another is soils that are not oxygen rich. Some of those, anaerobic decomposition processes, kind of bleed the oxygen out of the soil. And lastly, they have water at or near the surface during at least some part of the growing season. Vernal pools are really important around here. So if you've ever seen spotted salamanders, which are, black and yellow salamanders about 5 or 6 inches long, they're known for making these huge spring migrations and having these big communal breeding events in vernal pools that only exist for a short period of time in the spring. There are also some frog species that like to utilize those as well. Swamps, bogs, and fens, in practicality, like those are going to be kind of interchangeable. And then perhaps the most important one for our purposes are ponds, typically permanent, primarily open water bodies that are smaller than a lake. Sunlight may or may not penetrate the tree canopy to allow understory plants to grow, and a lot of time you'll see quite a bit of vegetation around the perimeter of a pond. So now that we're talking about wetlands, let's start to get into the methods of what we're going to do for monitoring. So there are two ways for choosing your FrogWatch site. One is to choose a pond or wetland area that is conveniently located for your household, or you can get in touch with me. My email is on the first slide, and I will put it in the chat right now, and I am more than happy to help you figure out somewhere near you that will work well for frog watching. Either way, it is important to choose a site that ideally you would be able to access weekly. If you don't get to your site every week, that is definitely not the end of the world. But in a perfect world, you would be out there once a week surveying. It's got to be somewhere that's pretty quiet. It's got to be legally accessible, and most importantly, it has to be safe for data collection in the evening. As much as we want you to be, just really adventurous and outgoing and all gung-ho about collecting FrogWatch data, the absolute most important thing for us is your safety. So if you don't feel safe, at your location, don't go there, and we can figure out, something else that'll work for you. Oh, too far. All right, so if you are using a site that has not previously been registered, you will have to collect a certain amount of information about that site. And I am just now realizing that I put these slides a little bit out of order. So the website that we use for data collection and entry is called FieldScope. There's a link to it a few slides ahead. But I took some screen captures of it that you can see right here as we're following along. And after the slides, if anyone would like, I am more than happy to pull up the website and we can spend a little time exploring it then as well. So if you are registering a new site, you'll need to collect the following information: the type of habitat, the origin of the wetland, the source or origin of the water, the permanence of the water, the use of land adjacent to the wetland, use of land within the wetland, and most importantly, latitude and longitude. All of that stuff above latitude and longitude is fantastic if you can figure it out. But if you can't, that's not a huge deal. Those are not required data fields, but the more we know about a site, the more helpful it is for us. Before you arrive at your site, we encourage you to practice identifying the calls so that you can figure out what frogs and toads you're listening to. Make sure that the weather conditions are appropriate for monitoring. So it needs to be above 35 degrees Fahrenheit, because below that point, you're just not gonna see a lot of frogs, and it can't be raining too hard, nor can it be too windy. Both of those things are factors that will decrease the likelihood of frogs calling, which just kind of makes your trip a little futile. Generally speaking, plan to monitor at least 30 minutes after sunset. That early dusk time is ideal frog calling time, because the lowering of the light just makes it safer for them to be out and about and making noise without the fear of getting eaten by something by advertising their location. And lastly, and I'm just going to stress this over and over again, please be safe and please conduct the surveys in groups of at least 2. When you arrive, you'll just need to enter volunteer and site info on the data sheet, and you also will need to enter a little bit of weather information, and that is this info right here. So air temp, wind speed using the Beaufort wind scale, which ranges from 0 being calm and a situation where smoke would rise straight up, all the way to 5, which is a fresh breeze, and at that point, small trees are beginning to sway. We would also like you to note the current precipitation as well as what has happened in the past 48 hours. Both of those are things that, again, impact the frogs calling. And, you know, we're just trying to get all this info to see if there are environmental factors that are going to impact the frogs, as well as, you know, just whether or not they're actually there. So the actual monitoring protocol is as follows. When you arrive at your site and you get set up, you need to be completely silent for at least 2 minutes before initiating the monitoring session, so that frogs and toads will acclimate to your presence a little bit. At that time, you're going to cup your hands around your ears and listen quietly for exactly 3 minutes. I suggest using a stopwatch on your phone for that time. During that time, listen to, identify, and try to remember all of the breeding calls that occurred during the session. One thing that can help you do that, that isn't required, is making an audio recording of the whole session. So, you know, when you cup your ears and start listening, also just hit record on your smartphone's recording app. While it's not required, it is something that you can submit as part of your data collection. And, you know, having those audio vouchers is a great way to just kind of increase the quality of data collection a little bit. And if the monitoring session is interrupted by, you know, a substantial amount of noise, which hopefully it won't be, just restart it, including that 2-minute acclimation period. If it's loud for you, it's going to be loud for the frogs and toads as well. And lastly, just make sure you're monitoring 10-ish feet away from the wetland. It may be tough to get that close, but depending on your site, but just kind of do your best. So once you finish those 3 minutes, pull up your data sheet and start by entering your start and stop time. List all of the species that you heard during the monitoring session and rate their calling intensity, which is something that I'll show in just a moment. And if you're uncertain about a species identification, don't report it. It's okay, you know, if you just can't quite tell what that frog is that's calling way off in the distance, it's fine. It's better to not record something than it is to incorrectly record it. And if no calls were heard, you just enter no calls heard on the data sheet. It is important to record both presence and absence, right? So, you know, ideally frogs are going to be there every time you go, but if for whatever reason there are no frogs at your site when you go, entering that 0 is really important for us to know as well. You know, maybe it represents some kind of weird anomaly, something strange going on with the frog population there, and that's important to record. So the calling intensity is ranked from 0 to 3, with 0 being no frogs or toads heard calling at all the way up to 3, which is a full chorus, meaning you can't tell how many frogs there are. All you know is there are a lot of them. And then you know, the 1 and the 2, that's just when there's like a few frogs calling. And that's something that, you know, if you're interested in coming to the in-person training sessions, hopefully we'll be practicing with the frogs that are there. This website, which I will also put in the chat, is the web page that we use to record our data. FieldScope is a website that has been hosted by National Geographic. So they are one of the partners of FrogWatch. And I think it's a relatively user-friendly website, and also one that if you access it from your phone, works pretty well on mobile devices as well. All right, now the kind of fun part. We're going to start moving into frog and toad calling identification. Before we get to the individual species. We're just going to talk a little bit about breeding and calling basics. So just like in birds, a lot of these frog calls that we're going to be hearing are going to be males advertising to females their readiness and fitness for breeding. So males will generally arrive at breeding sites first, and then they start advertising to all those females with these breeding calls, and the females are able to tell based on the quality of those breeding calls how fit an individual is for breeding. Once a male encounters a female, he will attempt to grab onto her back, basically, which is called amplexus. So this picture on the right-hand side of the screen shows a pair of wood frogs, I believe, in amplexus. So while they're in amplexus, the female will deposit her eggs, and while she's depositing her eggs, the male is going to be fertilizing those eggs. And if all goes well, sometime later, they will hatch into a bunch of little tadpoles. So frogs produce these sounds by using vocal sacs. There are 3 basic types of vocal sacs. There are single external sacs, which is kind of like your classic one that appears like a big old balloon underneath their chin. They'll have paired external vocal sacs, which, as you can see in this little diagram, they'll kind of expand out to the side of the face. And then the last one is an internal vocal sac. And in that situation, you'll basically see like the throat and that middle part of the body expand, as opposed to any sort of external vocal sac. So the temperature, the size of the individual calling, and any sort of acoustic interference can all influence call quality and frequency. Those are the reasons that we said, it's got to be above 35 degrees, can't be too rainy or windy, and also any sort of, loud noises that happen during your monitoring session, are grounds for resetting. Just because those all, impact the quality of your data, and we wouldn't want you to have artificially poor data, on account of something that's out of your control. Calls fall into one of about 5 groups. You have the advertisement call, which is what we've been mostly talking about. Those are distinct for each species, and just like birds, and are generally used to advertise the fitness and presence of a male. Then there are 4 other calls that we're not going to worry about, because they're not really calling cards for individual species in the same way that advertisement calls are. You have rain calls, release calls, alarm calls, and then aggressive calls, which I'm really just bringing up to point out that while we think of frogs as mainly having kind of their one species typical call, they do make a variety of different noises. So there are 14 species of frogs and toads in Michigan. However, we are not going to be encountering the boreal chorus frog nor the mink frog. Those 2 only exist on the Upper Peninsula. The rest of these 12 can be found on the Lower Peninsula. And these right here, the Blanchard's cricket frog, are of special significance. We'll talk more about them a little while later, but at this point, suffice it to say that they're a state endangered amphibian. So knowing where they are and if they are somewhere is extra important. Not that it's not important to know what these other frogs are doing, but Blanchard cricket frogs get a little bit of extra attention. All right, at this point, I am going to turn things over to Bill, and he is going to lead us in learning about frog and toad identification.
Thanks, Travis. Can you guys hear me okay? So the wood frog is one that's really interesting in that it's one of a couple of species of frog in Michigan that have been known to be able to freeze solid. They range further north than any other species of frog up into the Arctic Circle. And they have glycerol, an additive to their blood that keeps the cells from lysing or bursting open when they freeze. And they more or less shut down all their body functions in the winter and then come back to life in the spring when it gets warm enough. As a consequence, they're one of the first frogs that would be out there and calling in the springtime. They're not especially large frogs. A 3-inch wood frog is a pretty big frog. They tend to be kind of muddy brown to kind of a bronzy color. The big thing that is an identifying character for them is they've got that mask underneath their eye. And then there is a little bit of a white line that goes along their upper lip. And these guys are mostly woodland animals, and they will spend some time in some open grasslands. And they are obligate seasonal pool breeders. And what that means is that a lot of amphibians, in fact, most of our amphibians breed in pools of water that are only seasonally available. And those are really important for amphibians because there aren't a lot of fish predators. So Travis, do you want to try play on the call? We'll go to the call. I can't hear.
Give me just one moment here.
Oh, yep. So I'll talk about wood frogs, then they'll come in. So the wood frogs, their sound is a kind of a low quacking sound. To me, it always sounds like, what the heck are those ducks doing over there? So if you're out in the woods in the spring and you hear some very weird duck noises, that very well could be a wood frog call.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share the audio.
Okay.
We have this wonderful website that you can see on our FrogWatch page on our John Ball Zoo website called Froggy Voices of Michigan. And that's what I'm going to be using right now. And I also highly recommend that for learning the frog call. So here's that first one.
So it's just kind of a weird ducky noise. This is the spring peeper. This is another, there are 3 species of frog that really get started early, and the spring peeper is one of them. So that arrow there is pointing to an X on the back. That's one of the ways that in identification you can tell that it's a spring peeper. They're kind of orange to a brown color, and that X on the back is fairly consistent. To the next slide.
Yep.
And you see there's some pictures of these. These guys are tiny. So these are about the size of one of your, a big spring peeper is about the size of one of your fingernails. They're not an especially large frog. It's also, the call is very identifiable. It's a lot of people think of it as a big harbinger of spring. It's just a peep. And it's the only frog call that I can imitate.
That's really good. Now we'll hear the actual. I've always
One of
found
the,
it to be
oh,
just
go ahead.
soothing.
Yeah. And that was a chorus of spring peepers. So that was a bunch of them calling together, but you can kind of hear the individual calls. Another kind of cool thing about the spring peeper is their calls will get faster and more intense as the temperature gets warmer. And as it gets cooler, they'll get be a little bit more slow. So if you're out on a couple of different conditions, if you're out on a cool night, when the frogs are calling, you'll notice a difference than it's when it's a warmer night. And you will occasionally hear like a sharp peep that is a little bit harsher than their normal peep. Those are actually aggressive calls. So that is, these guys, you know, they don't have very long to breed. They're out for a very short amount of time. And if another male sort of sneaks into his territory, it's on. And they'll let each other know. So occasionally you'll hear this sort of weird, sharp peep that is like a peep, but it's just a little bit different. And that's usually you know, an aggressive call. If you are in fact 1 inch tall, I would move away from the wetland if you hear that. This is a pickerel frog. We have 2 spotted frogs that are very similar in this area, and we actually hear both of them calling in the area. The leopard frog is more common. This one is a little less common, and the call is significantly different. So the 2 arrows there are pointing out 2 different characters. One of them is the spots between those 2, what we call dorsolateral folds. So you see that sort of ridge that runs from the eye down towards the hips. That's dorsolateral folds. They have one on each side. And the spots between there, see how they're arranged in 2 fairly well-ordered lines. And the spots are more square than they are round. That's a classic pickerel frog character. And then they have sort of a yellow flash mark in their hips, you know, on their thighs and on their undersides. The idea is that if a predator were to try and eat them and they jumped really quickly and showed the flash mark, it might be a warning or at least a startle for the predator. So I would not suggest you try to eat one, but if you do try to eat one, he might try to scare you with that. They also have an irritating skin secretion, like most amphibians do. One of the things that's really interesting with these guys is, you know, folks that were collecting frogs have oftentimes found that if you put a pickerel frog in with other species of frog, the other species of frogs will die from being exposed to the pickerel frog. So luckily with the FrogWatch, you're not actually touching any frogs, so that shouldn't be an issue. And they're not especially big, like 1 to 3 inches. And do you want to do the call, Travis? It's a snore. Oh, that one's really sleepy. So the pickerel frog and the leopard frog have very similar calls. The pickerel frog has a snore, and then the leopard frog has a snore with a couple of chuckles. So the way you can tell the difference is if it just has the one part, the snore call, then you're looking at pickerel frogs, or you're listening to pickerel frogs. The leopard frog actually has a series of chuckles after the snore. So this is the leopard frog. It's the more common of the 2 species that we find in the area. And then you see this one's got the spots between its dorsolateral folds are a little bit more disorganized. They're more rounded. They're not as square. You can't really see the undersides in this photo, but they would not have that yellow flashing. These guys tend to come in a wide variety of different colors. You can see them in all sorts of browns and golds and even a little bit of silver. Sometimes you'll find them with some really deep green color too. So they can actually, if you see a lot of leopard frogs, there's some really pretty ones out there right here in our area. And they're one of my favorite calls. It's just so weird. They actually float on the surface of the water while they're calling. And they'll call a little bit underwater. So the sound, if you're out in the wetlands when they're calling. That's a cool recording because there's actually 3 species of frog calling in that one. But it did, if you guys could hear that snore, and then it's followed by and then later you'll all get a chance to, we'll open it up for everybody else to do their own imitations of frog calls. And this is being recorded too. So Blanchard's cricket frog, this is a really cool little frog. This frog is really like one of the early, in the early to mid 90s, one of the really big alarming sort of amphibian call stories was the Blanchard's cricket frog. This is a frog that was described by early authors studying the amphibians as being ubiquitous throughout the environment. When I was a kid, I remember visiting places where it was very hard to walk along the edge of the wetland without stepping on them. And many authors made reference to them being just at every habitat in huge numbers that they occurred. Sometime in the early to mid 90s, this frog more or less disappeared from almost all of the northern parts of its range. It's now extirpated from Canada. They're little tiny frogs. These guys are even smaller than spring peepers. And they have that sort of warty skin. Another really common characteristic is that triangle between the eyes. So if you look between the eyes, there's a triangle there. They can come in a wide variety of colors, and sometimes they have sort of some modeling of different colors. Green is really common. Sometimes you'll even find them with a little bit of gold. And then if you look at the picture there in the middle, you see the series of, that's actually a tadpole with a series of recent metamorphs. The tadpole has that black tail tip, so they're really highly identifiable as cricket frogs with that black tail tip. But if you look, the tadpole is actually larger than the adult frogs. So as a tadpole, these guys actually get bigger than the adult frogs. They only live to be about a year old. So these guys are, they specialize in early successional habitats. So habitats that don't have a lot of vegetation. And one of the reasons that they specialize in that is that they have kind of the highest thermal preference of any of our amphibians in this area. They really like high temperatures. So they like those open, bare, exposed places so they can bask. You'll even find the tadpoles will bask. So the tadpoles will congregate in shallow areas of water that are getting direct sunlight. And I've stuck my hand in the water where cricket frog tadpoles are, and it feels like lukewarm soup, or it feels like if you catch some of these guys, sometimes it feels like you just pull them out of the microwave. They're getting their temperatures up that high. So these guys have a really distinctive cool call. Because of that preference for higher temperatures, they start calling later in the season. So they're more like a July and August caller. And they sound like 2 rocks or 2 marbles being tapped together. Yeah, so you can hear that kind of that click, 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 click sound. They're another one that will, they'll actually start really slow. So a lot of times, these advertisement calls and attracting females is a pretty competitive business. So a lot of times you'll see this dynamic, or you hear this dynamic when you're listening to frogs in a wetland. One of them will start just a little bit. Tap, 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 tap. And as he gets more wound up, he'll increase the intensity and the frequency of the taps will increase. And as the other frogs join in, they all kind of speed up and they'll slow down depending on how intense they're going. So it's a pretty dynamic call. This one calls fairly long distance too. This is American toad. This is actually, Tom Petty wrote a song about this toad. But these are the common backyard toads. They have warts all over their skin. And you can see I'm pointing at the screen. You guys can't see where I'm pointing. But you can see the parotid gland, which is that sort of swollen gland of venom right there behind the eye. And that they're actually fairly toxic, although they're not really toxic to you unless you put them in your mouth or put them in your eyes or stick them up your nose, which you should not have to do for the frog and toad call surveys. But they're the toad that you find in your backyard. If you look at that blotch, they can be blotched all over their back, and there can be highly variable. But if you look at that blotch, there's a relatively small number of warts in that blotch. There's usually 1 to 3 tops warts per blotch. And just tuck that away in the back of your mind, and we'll talk about why that's significant later. So they can be fairly decent sized. Toads, frogs, the frogs in our area tend to make big rafts or big, globs of eggs. When you see those out in the wild, toads tend to make long strings, and they're long, curly, cute strings. So that bottom picture, you can kind of see off to the right of the toads that are breeding there. You can see those curly, cute strings of eggs. If you see those, they're almost certainly a toad. They do really well. American toad does really well in all different types of habitat, including backyards and swimming pools and things like that. That's why this is one of the more familiar toad frogs that we have in our area. The other thing that is really kind of fun and entertaining about toads is that the males will grasp just about anything when they are calling. And when they're in the full height of their breeding season, they'll call out in the daytime. They'll call right in front of you. You can walk right up to them with a camera and take pictures of them inflating their vocal sac. If you put your fingers right down in front of them, sometimes the males will clasp you and try to breed you. If you watch them, you'll get large, big congregations of mating toads all together. They do a release call, so males will do a quick little chirp, 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 which is a signal to other males to release that, hey, buddy, I'm not a female. And spent females will do that too. But watching a breeding group of toads is a really entertaining time. So American toad has the longest call of any of they can go for like 30 seconds. And you can hear each one of those trills is one toad, and that's one big toad breath and then a call. So they're really, there's nothing else out there that calls for that duration like that. So it's that high pitched sort of musical trill. Here's the Fowler's toad. This toad is a little less common. It's much more reliant on sandy soils. And if you look where that arrow is pointing, you can see the warts on the back of a Fowler's toad. There's 4 to 5 warts per blotch on a Fowler's toad. So they have more warts in each one of those blotches. The blotches tend to be bigger, but it's really what you're doing is counting the warts in those blotches. And that's the easiest character to tell if you've got a Fowler's toad. The other way that if you flip them over, American toads tend to have mottled bellies with lots of spotting on their bellies. And Fowler's toads tend to either have completely white bellies or they have one single dot in the middle of their chest with very clean bellies. They're about the same size, maybe a little bit smaller than American toads. They're burrowers during the hot season, and they're not out and active in your backyard as nearly as much as American toads would be. And they're much more dependent on sandy soils. But we do get these guys around here in West Michigan and in the Grand Rapids area. Now, the call here, one of our colleagues has a great way of describing the call of the Fowler's toads. Fowler's toads and American toads have similar calls. But he always says that if you ever have a friend who thinks they can sing, but really, really is bad at singing, but they sing really loudly anyway, That's the way you tell the difference between a Fowler's toad and an American toad. The Fowler's toad is the American toad that thinks it can sing, but really can't sing that well. It's much harsher, much more nasally. They also don't have the vocal stamina that American toads do. I mean, who does really? But yeah, so that's the Fowler's toad. This is green frog. So the green frog and the bullfrog are the two sort of permanent water frogs that we see a lot around here in West Michigan. I actually see many more green frogs than I see bullfrogs in West Michigan. Green frogs tend to be smaller than the bullfrog does, but a big green frog is going to be very similar to a smallish or a medium-sized bullfrog. So the one way you can tell them the difference is that dorsolateral fold that we talked about earlier. The arrow is pointing to it. It's that line that goes from the eye down towards the hips. Green frogs have it and bullfrogs do not. So if you see that dorsolateral fold on a frog that you think is either a green frog or a bullfrog, it's going to be a green frog. So you can see there's a nice big beefy green frog there, but it's still got that dorsolateral fold. And then one thing that's kind of cool about green frogs and bullfrogs, this doesn't hold true for other species of frog in West Michigan, but that big circle behind the eye that's on that upper picture is really clear. That is at least the size or twice the size of the eyeball in males. Females tend to have them that are smaller than the eyeball. And then that bottom picture, you can see the vocal sac. And these guys have the twang of a loose banjo string. It's a really distinctive call. Yep, so that's a green frog call. Green frogs and bullfrogs tend to spend more time in permanent bodies of water. Their tadpoles take longer to develop, and they tend to call a little bit later in the season. There's the bullfrog. The bullfrog is an interesting frog, and it's been implicated in a lot of amphibian declines. Because that chytrid fungus disease that Travis was talking about earlier, bullfrogs tend to be resistant to it, so they tend to be carriers for it. And bullfrogs, because they are so big, have been introduced. People trying to farm them for food markets or put them in ornamental ponds. Bullfrog has been introduced in habitats where it's not supposed to be all over the world. Here in Michigan, the bullfrog is actually native. So when you see them around here, they're probably a native frog instead of an introduced frog. But all over California, the bullfrog's a big problem for a number of different species of frog that would be introduced disease from bullfrogs or just flat out eaten by giant bullfrogs. The other thing that I like to people don't really realize this backyard frog, the frog that we have here in Michigan, the bullfrog, is actually one of the world's largest frogs. They're 3 to 8 inches long, and that's a really big frog. The largest frog in North America for sure. We have occasionally gotten calls from folks that have set up ponds, around their bird feeders, and have been really excited when bullfrogs move in. And then all of a sudden, they're really mad when they realize the bullfrogs are eating the birds. So they're voracious feeders. They'll eat on anything. They will eat cricket frogs. So they're more tied to permanent bodies of water because their tadpoles take over a year to develop into frogs, which is really unusual for most of our amphibians. Bullfrogs also will make the alarm call that Travis mentioned. So for a good time, Google bullfrog alarm calls, and you'll hear some pretty crazy stuff there. Well, we should listen to the advertisement call because that's really what we're talking about.
There we go.
So that was a really interesting recording because there were green frogs calling at the beginning of it, but that jug of rum, that rum, 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 that's the bullfrog. I was making this hand gesture because one of the ways I've heard it described is if you take a really taut balloon and rub your hand across it, it makes a similar noise.
Mm.
Gray tree frog. There's actually 2 species of gray tree frog in Michigan, and they are actually, one is diploid and one is triploid. There's just a very minute genetic difference between the 2 different species. Visually, they are identical to each other, and it's very difficult to tell the difference. What's really interesting about these guys is that the Cope's gray tree frog is found all throughout Michigan, but is much more common in the Upper Peninsula. And the gray tree frog is found all throughout Michigan, but much more common in the Lower Peninsula. So if you find a gray tree frog, here gray tree frogs in the Lower Peninsula, they're much, much more likely to be gray tree frogs. But if you hear them up in the Upper Peninsula, they're much more likely to be Cope's gray tree frogs. And there is a difference in the call, and we'll listen to that. So these guys have kind of a bird-like call. It's a very pretty sort of, and they're kind of a summer call.
I'm just gonna play those calls back to back so that we can hear them right next to each other.
That sounds like a good idea. And to me, I think these guys are very similar to the American toad and the Fowler's toad. The gray tree frog has a very pretty bird-like voice, and the Cope's gray tree frog sounds like a gray tree frog that can't sing that well.
So that was our classic Eastern gray tree frog with some spring peepers present, beautiful little chirp, chirp, chirps. And now I'm going to play the Cope's gray tree frog.
But you can see that one is one that, you can't tell the difference except for the calls. Here's the Cope's gray tree frog. They can both be frosty green or gray. And individual frogs will change color based on temperature and mood. They are also one of the species of frog like the wood frog that are able to withstand freezing solid. So in the wintertime, these guys probably just go down in the leaf litter and freeze solid. They're very similar to the gray tree frog. Gray tree frogs also do really well as being forested and forested wetlands, but also in backyards. So grill cover is a common habitat type for these guys. They will actually, sometimes people will find them hanging out next to their exterior lights on their house because that's a great place to hang out. You can hang out there, and at night, there's lots of insects to eat hanging around there. So occasionally people will find these gray tree frogs hanging out on the exterior of their house near their lights or in their grill covers. And then Western chorus frog. This is actually a species of frog that starts calling really early with our wood frogs and our spring peepers. These guys are tiny. They're even smaller than the spring peepers. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between these guys and the spring peeper. So if you look at the lines that are on the back of this frog, you can see that they tend to be run longitudinally along the body and they don't cross. Those lines can be highly variable, but they tend not to cross. So if you see crossed lines on their back, they tend to be they're spring peepers. The other identifying characters, if you look at the upper lip of this frog, it has a white line that kind of goes along that upper lip, and spring peepers don't have that. These guys have a really cool call. If you have a really hard plastic comb and you run your fingers down the comb, that will make the call very similar to what the chorus frog does.
Yep, I'll play that right now.
Yeah. Yep, so you can hear that. And there were peepers in that recording too. When that's a really cool thing. You know, one of the things that you'll find, you know, might be kind of intimidating to try and remember all these calls. Don't worry about that too much. There's a phrenology, or the order in which these guys start to call. So at any given time, you may only be challenged with 2 or 3, I mean, tops, maybe 4 calls at a time. It's nowhere near as intimidating as learning bird calls, where you have maybe potentially hundreds of species of birds calling at any given time. And there's also lots of resources if you want to record those. Travis, do you want to talk a little bit about the phrenology of the calling in this area?
Yeah, so just like Bill was just talking about, and I've kind of made a chart here to represent that. Each month, you're probably not going to be tasked with figuring out too many different frog calls at any one time. My hunch is that April and May are, might be the toughest times, as you get some overlap of some of those early season frogs are still maybe hanging on and calling a little bit, but as the weather warms up and is more suitable for some of these other species, you're going to start hearing some things like the pickerel and the leopard frog and the toads and the tree frogs get going. So that's really the only time of year that you're going to run into that. But in general, you can see how long these bars are. It's showing the months in which you can expect them to be calling, and it's not even necessarily the whole month, right? So the Blanchard's cricket frog says May, June, July. I wouldn't, late July, I wouldn't necessarily expect to still hear them. You may, it's possible, but it's just within those months is the typical range for breeding activity for these species. But my one caveat to that is, trust your training, right? So like if you spent time practicing frog call listening, and it's a season where you wouldn't expect green frogs to be calling, but if you are listening to frogs and you are certain that you heard a green frog, don't second guess yourself. That's some of the important phenology change info that we're really interested in, right? Like if a species has started to breed outside of what season we expect, we really want to know that, so that management decisions can be made accordingly. So feel free to refer back to this slide. I think what I'll do, since I should have a way to contact you all, is I can send out these slides as a PDF, so that you'll have them on hand if you want to refer to anything. And I can just send out like an email in the next few days here, basically like a little packet of info. It'll have these slides, and I'll include links to the Field Scope website and the Froggy Voices website, so that so that we can all have the stuff we need to be successful at this. And to finish up, here are some next steps. If you haven't already, I would highly, highly encourage you and recommend that you go to johnballzoo.org/frogwatch. And on that page, you will find a place to sign up to be a FrogWatch volunteer. I just put that link in the chat. If you sign up to be a volunteer, that's how I'll get your email address, and then you'll be looped into any communications that we have as a team of frog watchers at John Ball Zoo. And after that, and if you have a site that, you know, in your mind that you are absolutely dying to do, you are more than welcome to begin frog watching. Or if you would like, or maybe or feel free to attend one of our upcoming in-person training sessions. So on March 23rd, right around sunset, I will be at Millennium Park, and we will talk through the protocol again, and we'll practice doing it, and we'll spend some time out there, hopefully listening to some of those early season frogs that, you know, should be calling here soon. And then April 6th, which is 2 weeks after the 23rd, we will have another in-person training session at a different location, just in case people can't make it to the one on the 23rd. That location is TBD at this point. But as soon as we figure that out, an email will be sent out to everyone with the appropriate information. So at this point, we're done with slides. Where's the stop sharing? There it is. And if there are any questions that, you know, looking through the chat, there was really, it seemed like just the one question about like what counts as an interruption. Oh, Madeline, it looks like you have a question. Yeah.
Should be an easy one. Do you know where exactly you'll be meeting in Millennium Park?
That's a good question.
At the moment, because there are the two parking lots. My hunch is that I'll send it out in an email so that everyone knows. But I'm planning on meeting on the side with like the playground over by like the larger water body, and then we'll probably walk back behind, because there are a few great ponds on the backside of Millennium Park that have typically had pretty good frog calling activity.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe bring a flare gun.
Yeah.
Might not hurt.
Yeah, that might count as an interruption.
Yeah, should it go off?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, one new message in the chat.
Oh. And we've heard cricket frogs there the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Heard some last year. Mm-hmm. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Mm-hmm. Can I describe the differences in the 0 to 3 individual call groups? Yes, I can. So 0 would be no calls at all. You didn't hear any frogs. 1 would be like somewhere between about like 1 and 5 frogs. You can pick out individual frogs. You can count the individual males who are calling. I would count that as a 1. Anywhere between that and like a loud, raucous, full chorus. So, you know, there's some overlapping calls. Maybe if you were paying really close attention, you could count how many frogs there were, but, you know, probably not. I would consider that a 2. And then if it's, you know, consistently overlapping calls for the 3-minute monitoring period, then I would consider that a 3. And it is not a huge deal if you, you know, are feeling stuck between categories. Just choose whichever one you think is, you know, best suited for what you're listening to. It's, you know, it's definitely not the end of the world. And as you listen to more and more frogs, you'll start to get a better idea of like what a full chorus is, what a partial chorus is, when it's really just a few individuals calling over and over again. That's something that really comes with experience. But
I think that's another thing too. Like, you know, to me, there's a couple of different purposes for this, and obviously like the data and, knowing what's going on with the frogs locally is super important, but also I think one of the most important aspects of this is getting people out listening for frogs and having fun with it. And it's getting out and like hearing spring peepers, watching green frogs wrestle with each other territorially. All those things are super fun. Watching toads wrestle around with each other, that or calling at night is it's a lot of fun. So make sure you're having fun with it too.
Is it Anya? Anya?
Yeah, Anya. I have a curiosity question. You mentioned earlier that sometimes the acoustic interference. I think I had an interesting experience with that. It was probably 4 or 5 years ago now. My mom and I were in the woods, and we crossed the train tracks down into kind of a wetland area, and we were watching from up on the rocky area, and all the frogs were singing. It was definitely a chorus. They were making a ton of noise. They were doing all sorts of frog shenanigans.
Yeah.
And the train went by. So they went silent. And then after the train went by, they all started singing again, but it was completely a different pitch almost. They went to a totally different pitch.
Yeah.
Would that be what you're talking about when you say
Oh yeah,
that?
they do that, and it's especially something like that. It's really entertaining. I think it's you have something like a big disturbance like that, and they don't just come right back on. Boom, we're all back. It's like, well, and there's definitely a competition thing. So you almost picture like they're all like waiting to see who's going to call first, and there is like. To call, it's super energy expensive. It also exposes you to predators. You're like, here I am. I'm a little soft little body here that's easy to eat. So they don't like to be the only one calling. So they're all kind of like, wait, but if one starts calling, then the others will join in. So you get that sort of one lonely peeper. And then another one will start, and it'll ramp up in intensity, but they definitely respond to each other, and that ramps up the intensity.
Yeah, it was the craziest thing.
I've seen the opposite thing too, where chorus frogs that frequency is not too dissimilar from a motorcycle. So I've had that happen a couple of times where I'm out listening for chorus frogs and something happens, a plane goes over, or I fall in, or something like that. Those are all plausible disturbances. But and they all shut up and they're all waiting. And a motorcycle goes by, and there's something about that frequency that trips them. They all go, oh, there's somebody's really calling loud now, and they all start back up.
Yeah, that like, frog dependent calling, waiting for other frogs to call is actually something that like occasionally is a technique in the zoo field for encouraging captive frogs to breed. Because sometimes males need that competition to be spurred into that breeding activity. So you just play a recording of that species of frog calling, and sometimes it'll get those other males going, because like, oh, there's a whole bunch of healthy males here that are coming from my females or whatever. So that's something that, zoos have done before to like get, rare frogs to breed.
Yeah, and you'll see there's like a whole crazy reproductive ecology and behavior stuff surrounding there. So like it's been described in American toads, but I'm sure it happens in a lot of other species that there's sneaker males where, the energy and the exposure to predation that you get from calling is pretty expensive. Like that's really dangerous stuff to be doing. And so you'll get a male who will sit on the edge of a chorus or next to a really loud male, and then try and sneak in and grab the female before the calling male gets to it, So he's trying to reap the benefits of all that calling activity that the one male does without a lot of the risk.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other questions? Because Bill and I could talk about this all night. And we will if no one stops us.
Yeah, we probably will after you guys go.
Oh, cool. Hannah, so from Saret, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it.
Yeah.
Bill and I were talking about that place earlier today. It sounds like a really awesome area.
We've got a couple of folks from Surrett here.
Nice.
Yeah, it's pronounced Surrett Nature Center. Me and Devin work there.
Very cool.
We did some of the Massasauga rattlesnake surveys over the last summer too.
Awesome. So cool.
Yeah, we're excited to survey this spring.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's great. The more the merrier. I hope people are surveying everywhere.
Yeah, and you guys get huge choruses of pickerel frogs down there, don't you?
I'm not sure. I don't know if I've ever heard the pickerels, but at least at Surrett, I know we get huge chorus frogs and peepers in the early spring.
Mhm.
And we're close to Grand Mere too, where they have the Blanchard's cricket frogs there.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So thanks, guys.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thanks for coming.
Bay City. Oh, okay.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. I would check Enya to see if Saginaw or Detroit have FrogWatch. I mean, you're more than welcome to do it through John Ball Zoo, I'm more than happy to facilitate that.
Well, and it all still goes in the same database.
Yeah, it does.
So
I don't
it's
know. I'm not too familiar with whether or not either of those zoos have a
Detroit used to. I don't know if they still are. Mhm.
yeah, obviously I won't be as much help in, if you want help selecting a body of water. But the rest of the stuff I can definitely still help out with.
I know Potter Park had one last year or the year before, but I haven't seen any communications about it
Sure.
this
Yeah.
year. So I figured I would jump on one, at
Yeah.
least get
Yeah.
an idea of what it was. And
It's the same. It's the same protocol. So you should have no problem doing it with with this
yeah.
training. It's a little bit geographically different, but
Yeah.
I mean,
And
the-
my husband and I go to a wetland area near here, and we've actually been keeping track of a huge group of bald eagles and
Oh, cool.
juveniles that are out here,
Mhm.
and it's a wetland area. So
Mhm.
I just keep waiting every day we go, like, where are the frogs? Where are the frogs? They're not
oh
out
yeah.
yet, but they're coming. The ice is finally disappearing. So
They are coming. I was out the other day, hoping that the ground would be thawed enough for
Mhm.
salamanders to be out, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah,
that
I
would
know
be
all
my dream.
Yeah, all my buddies on Facebook that do salamander studies are all posting pictures of salamanders and traps. I'm like, man, there's still ice in our wetlands.
Yeah, today's the first day I've seen open water in that wetland in
Okay.
everything
Mhm.
froze pretty well after that warm day. And
Mhm.
the only thing is I might try to find one that's a little more inland, because it is always windy off of the bay.
Mm,
It is
yeah.
fairly sheltered from trees, so I'll be kind of curious to see.
Mhm.
Devin, what about surveying them? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Surrett has not got a lot of salamanders that we know, but we've observed leadback and redback salamanders, and I'd like to keep track of their populations in a couple spots where we know they exist, and I didn't know if you guys have any experience with that. It's all very new to us, so.
A little bit.
We could probably share some articles too.
I was gonna say,
That would be good.
I know of a recent study that was I think it was done by a master's student. It was hugely effort intensive, looking at I think it was looking specifically at study design for forest plethodontid salamanders and cover board arrays. So
Mhm.
I think I have your email address. I think we're on an email chain together.
Yeah.
So that we can definitely share some articles.
Yeah, yep. I was just thinking about starting some cover board arrays. So I was looking that up and just how to start that.
Well, yeah.
So,
Well, one or both of us will be emailing you about
Yeah.
it. I love
Cool.
salamanders.
thanks a bunch, guys. Yeah, we don't have we don't have tiger salamanders or other things, but these are the ones we got. So I'm like, well, we better watch them.
Yeah. Well, if you have all those other amphibians,
Yeah.
I would be shocked if you didn't have a pretty decent, diversity of salamanders down there as well.
Nothing observed as far as we know, but because like historically we haven't really kept records of these things. So it's possible.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if you've got 4 toads there.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat there.
Riley's. By loud, do you mean like frogs and stuff?
Yeah, definitely. The gray tree frogs and the spring peepers are like.
It is not an issue. It is certainly not an issue at all. As a matter of fact, like about 10 feet away from the water is like a perfect distance. If you're a little further away than that, that's not an issue at all. And it is not required to do visual, any visual verification.
Okay.
It's all call based.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, but that's awesome that you have a loud wetland near you. That's perfect.
Yeah, that's really why I was interested in joining in on this, because I hear it and I'm like, it's too dark for that to be birds. It's got to be frogs, and I'm just curious what they are. So this is really cool.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
While this group of people are still here, does anyone want me to go to pull up the Field Scope webpage, or do you all feel comfortable exploring it yourself?
I think it'd be kind of cool just to see it. Yeah, that'd be great.
I can absolutely do that.
Field scope, field scope, field scope, field scope.
The crowd is chanting my name. Okay, here we go. So, drag. Okay, do you guys see anything on the website other than just like the Field Scope stuff? Like, are your own videos covering part of the screen, or is that just on mine?
I think it's just on yours.
Perfect.
I've just got you and what you're trying to show us with Field Scope.
That is ideal.
Mhm.
So frogwatch.next.fieldscope.org will take you to this page. So this is the landing page, the home page. It has some info, goals, how to participate, all that kind of stuff. You can click through the tabs, you get some cool visualization. If it's might not load. Sometimes there's a nice big map. This is the one that I'm thinking of. So this nice big map that it'll show my data, or you can pull it up to show like recent observations, which takes a little while because there are a lot. So, you can see mostly on the eastern seaboard where maybe they've already had some thawing, those lucky dogs. And then the most important tab for us is going to be this add data tab. So it looks an awful lot like what I showed you the screen captures of. For choosing a station, if you click previously used stations, it'll literally just be ones that you have previously used, not ones that have been previously used by other people. You can also pull up all stations, which is like all stations, and you can start typing. So like Millennium, 2 N's on Millennium, that's why I didn't come up. So like Millennium Park, right? So Hanson Nature Trail entrance, off-season parking lot pond. I'm guessing another one. Oh, nothing from Salt Lake Bog. Then we will get someone out there to survey that. So you can pick your site, or you can add your own. So you can either drag this around and zoom in, or you can just type in the latitude and longitude. For station name, if it's a park, it would be great if you could name it after the park. If not that, then just something that is descriptive enough that if I were scrolling through a list, like, and I don't know what you'd call yours, but like Bay City, Shore Pond or something like that. Something that where it is. And And then drop down menus for characterizing land use. So just 3 categories there. Wetland origin. Again, not a ton of categories, so you don't have to be an expert, like late ice age, glacial scrape, yeah, you don't have to know any of that stuff. The permanence of the wetland, that's going to be more important. And then, just the water source. So like, it's pretty straightforward, honestly. And as you can see, only the station name and not even technically the location, but just like the dot and then the state. Those are the only actually required pieces of info there. There is not a specific app. The website does adjust for mobile interfaces, right? So it's going to be more user friendly on your phone than just like a web page that you have to zoom around, all weird to use. So I just canceled that. And then down here, if you scroll down further on this observation page, you have some tabs, date, start time, end time. I know those aren't required, but please try and be diligent about that, just so we know when you're out there looking at stuff. Bill, do you care at all if they use Celsius or Fahrenheit? It's of no great consequence to me. You're muted, but I think I saw you say no. Yeah,
Yeah.
doesn't matter 1 iota to me. And then just some of that weather stuff: wind, precipitation during visit, precipitation in the last 24 hours, and then the temperature in the last 20 or 48 hours is really as simple as above freezing, below freezing, or I don't know. So very, very simple. And then for frog and toad observations, you'll have to scroll through this. It's the entire list, but for example, it's like, oh, those American toads, they're out there doing their thing. And then call intensity, is a 3. There were a lot of them. We are not the eastern subspecies, correct, Bill? We're not far enough east for that.
No, we're just the American toad.
Old American toad. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure. And so if you hear multiple species calling, you just add another observation and submit them all together. If there's anything specific that you want to note, like had to restart twice because of, acoustic interference or whatever, that can be useful. And then here's that spot for choosing an audio file. I would love for y'all to submit audio files if at all possible. I've been playing around with the sensitivity of like an iPhone, just like the stock recording app. It seems like it'll be plenty sensitive to hear calling frogs, by and large. I was playing with it at work the other day and was able to like pick up a colleague talking at the other end of the hallway of a building. So that's, you'll be at least that close to the wetlands that you're listening to, so it should be just fine. And then at the end of it, you just hit save observation, and and there you have it. And then you've frog watched. Yeah, I think that's basically the whole quick overview.
Yeah.
Feel free to shoot us any other questions. Please sign up so that I can get your emails and send you updates over the course of the season.
Yeah, and that goes into our volunteer program.
Yeah, our data.
So
yeah.
And then it'd be nice too at the end of the year if you're active doing the frog watch, even if you do it once, to record in that once you're registered in that volunteer group, just record the number of hours that you spent doing it. So at the end of the season, we have a report of X number of hours doing frog watch.
I believe so. If you got the email this afternoon, yes. If you're getting emails, then
Mhm. Yep. Well, and that means that we'll be able to get in touch with you too.
Yep, yeah, I can send out that little packet
Mhm.
of info, as it were. Yeah.
Well, awesome.
Well, thank you all so much for sitting through an hour and a half training. If you're feeling nervous about, am I going to be able to do it? You're going to be fine. Just get out there and start frog watching, and you'll be great. I'm
Mhm.
sure of it. And either way, you're out there listening to frogs in wetlands. So,
Mhm.
that in and of itself is a victory.
It sure is. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Travis.
I have
Yeah.
one more question for you guys. Sorry, before
Yeah.
we go.
Oh, no problem.
I found a video that I took last year. Could we do, like, if the audio will work? Can we do like a demo identification of what I have?
Yeah.
Let me turn
Sure.
this up and then see if I can capture it here.
You probably
Oh, sorry.
Uh,
Way up.
I,
was
You guys
that
see that
on?
okay? Yeah, that was one video.
Okay.
that's,
So what do you think that is?
So I heard lots of spring peepers. That one I can get.
mhm.
And then there was like one that sounded kind of like I keep thinking it sounds like a bird or like a chuckle, and I don't remember from the presentation which one it might be.
I think I know what you're talking about. And I think that is one of those weird, aggressive spring peeper calls.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. You're not an inch tall, are you?
I'm not.
Okay, then you should be all right.
Hard to tell over Zoom, I know, but
Yep.
yeah. Okay. All right, cool. So just spring peepers then in that video then.
That was all I got from that one.
Okay.
But
What would you call the call intensity?
That would be a 3, I would think. Right? No?
I would go with maximum call intensity. So at the beginning, at the end, there were like a ton of frogs calling.
Yep.
And then for like a while there was literally one frog calling. So that would have been a 1, but I would say like whatever the maximum call intensity is that you
Use that one instead. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Again, that was just something that hearing them one by one was really good in the presentation, but hearing them kind of overlap, it's a little bit different. So thank you for going through that with us.
Yeah, and you'll start to notice when you, like, as you're Googling those frog calls or doing something like this, that like there aren't a ton of, like, it's hard to get like a clean, there's just one species of frog calling in this recording.
Yep.
Mhm.
and
Cool.
on froggyvoice.com, which I put in the chat, you can select multiple frogs at one time, and it'll play those recordings on top of one another. So like if you want to practice, like, oh, what's it going to sound like when chorus frogs and spring peepers are calling at the same time or whatever, you can literally choose any combination of those frogs to listen to at one time. It's a really beautiful website that was put together by some herpetologists in Michigan, and I think it's an amazing resource.
There is a USGS website that we can share too, that sets up, like, it'll run you through the different, you can type in your region and it'll run through the different frog calls that you should find locally. And then there's a test that you can take at the end. So they actually will give you like some test material, like they'll give you some recordings and ask you to record what species of frog are in there.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, if there are no other questions,
Yeah.
I think we'll wrap up here, and we will get that recording posted and get some information out to you all. And away we go. Frog season is right around the corner. So
Thanks, everyone.
yeah. Thank you.
Happy frogging.